Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Church of God in Garrison. I'm glad you joined me for this particular message. I've entitled this message, A Decision on the Border of Egypt. It's the second part of my series on a question and a decision from the book of Jeremiah, chapters 40 through 44. We're going to be looking at chapter 43, beginning in verse 4. But chapter 43 is a fascinating chapter. We are caught there with an interesting circumstance. As I told you last Sunday, Jeremiah and his compatriots have been taken hostage, first of all, by the assassins of Governor Gedaliah, who was under the authority of the Babylonians. And the assassins were attacked by the militia, the Jewish militia, and all of them were repatriated only to be taken hostage by the Jewish militia captains, who were terrified of the Babylonians and decided they wanted to flee to Egypt. They had stopped in near Bethlehem on the northern part of the town of Bethlehem. And there they had asked for God's decision and had asked Jeremiah to get a message from God on what they should do. And Jeremiah comes back to them with the message: you need to stay in the land. If you stay in the land, Nebuchadnezzar will not harm you. But if you go to Egypt, destruction will come upon you. And the commanders yell at Jeremiah, "You're lying. You're telling us a complete whopper here, because we don't want to believe you. You must be in the pay of Baruch the scribe, because he wants to stay. And so that must be the circumstances. You're in cahoots with him, and we don't want to believe you. And even if God said this, we're going to go to Egypt anyway." And so that's exactly what they do. Jeremiah and all the other refugees that are now hostages are forced to go with Jeremiah and Baruch and the militias down to Egypt. They arrive at the city of Tahpanhes, which was on the border of Egypt. It was a city that had been built just a few decades before by the Egyptian pharaohs in hopes of protecting Egypt from Assyrian incursion. They had failed in that hope, but it still remained a garrisoned city, and most of the time it was garrisoned with Greek mercenaries. The Egyptians had spent a lot of money making it look like sort of a major port of entry, but it really, at this time, clearly was not operating in that manner. In fact, it seems from the statements in Jeremiah that it was pretty much deserted, because Jeremiah was able to take and rip up part of the royal pavement, which was a platform of brick that had been designated as belonging to the pharaoh, and he was able to tear up some of the bricks from that pavement and bury large stones underneath them without any objection from anybody. So that tells us that there wasn't a whole lot of order or structure left in that community, which coincides with a lot of what we know of that period of time in Egyptian and Babylonian conflict. So they come to the border of Egypt, and Jeremiah says to them, by burying those large stones under that pavement, Nebuchadnezzar will come here one day, and he will place his pavilion over this spot, and from there he will direct attacks on Egypt. And that likely happened about 18 years after this prophecy. The reality of what happens here is that Jeremiah goes on to tell them, if you have started to run, You will continue to run, and devastation will come on Egypt, and you will have to keep running. When we start panicking in our lives and we start running, we lose our sense of proportion and faith, and we have to keep running. And that's one of the devastating things that Jeremiah tells these refugees. This is actually the last information that we will have of Jeremiah's life. He is likely around the age of 58 at this point. He has spent his life in ministry to God and service to God. We don't know where Jeremiah died. We assume it was somewhere in Egypt. We do not know when exactly he died. We simply know that it was probably in Egypt and probably sometime within a decade of this event. So that's all we really know of Jeremiah's last years. But we do know that God's message to the Jewish people was serious, and it was important for them to understand. When we give way to panic in our lives, when we allow panic to drive our future, our purpose, our meaning, and our direction, then we will have to keep running, and we will not do the will of God. We will be caught in a destructive cycle that just keeps swallowing us up. Jeremiah is accused of being in the employ, as it were, of Baruch, his scribe, which seems silly at the face of it. We know quite a bit about Baruch. He appears quite often in the book of Jeremiah. He appears at the first point during the time of King Jehoiakim, which would have been about 18 years before this event. There, Jeremiah commissions him with a message to read to the Jewish people. Jeremiah has been barred from speaking to the Jewish people. It is shortly before the great battle in 605 of Carchemish. And at that battle, the Egyptians were expected to beat the Babylonians and reestablish the Assyrian Empire. They were in league with the Assyrians at that point, but the Babylonians won the day, and the Egyptians were severely defeated, and they were fleeing homeward. In their wake came the Babylonian army. Nebuchadnezzar stopped in Jerusalem and basically forced Jehoiakim, who was the king, to hand over thousands of hostages to be taken back to Babylon. Those hostages would include Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would be taken back to Babylon. But in this circumstance, you find Jeremiah telling the scribe Baruch, write this letter for me. And when you write it, I want you to speak to the people and read it in their presence in the temple during the fast that is coming. And sure enough, a few months later, a fast was proclaimed in Judah, and the people gathered at the temple, and Baruch stood up in the middle of the temple and read the prophecy against Jerusalem to the people of Judea. And they were concerned, and many of the elders took Baruch aside and said, where did you get this message? And they said, did Jeremiah dictate it to you exactly? And he said, yes, I took it down as his exact dictation. The elders say to him, do not speak any more of this. We need to take it to the king. But you and Jeremiah hide yourself, for the king will come after you when he hears this. And that's exactly what happened. During that prophetic moment when Baruch is writing this down, Jeremiah turns to him and said, "This is what the Lord says to you. You have wanted to build yourself up in this kingdom. You had wanted to create a name for yourself. You had wanted to become somebody important, but I tell you, God says, this nation will be plucked up. That which I have planted, I will pluck up. But you I will establish, and even though you will not become great in this kingdom, you will have your life, and I will watch over you wherever you go." And that is God's promise to the scribe Baruch. And that's what gave him the courage to stand up in the face of panic and do what was necessary and what God had called him to do. It wasn't an easy thing for this scribe Baruch. He was from a wealthy, powerful family in the city of Jerusalem. His brother was in the king's service. His brother would eventually become one of the leaders and literally a part of the council of King Zedekiah, who would come to the throne after Jehoiakim. And he would be an important man in the land of Judah. But Baruch saw his commitment to God as being more important than fear or panic or his desires for the future. And that's important for each one of us to realize. Once we start panicking, we will continue to panic in our lives. The people of Judah would continue running down the Nile River south, or up the Nile River south, into further and further into the continent of Africa. They would end up in Elephantine, and then eventually they would disappear from there. It is believed that their descendants are called the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, as they're characterized, who were found far, far up the Nile basin, up along what's called the Blue Nile, at the very headwaters of the Blue Nile, which would be over 2,000 miles south from where Jeremiah made this prophecy. It's an interesting event in the lives of these Jewish people, and a tale for us about how panic can drive our lives in a direction that is destructive to us. The writer of Hebrews, speaking at a time when Christians were struggling with panic in his own world, writes to them in chapter 10, "Do not lose your confidence," he tells them. "Remain confident and do not shirk back from the truth of the gospel and from your faith." He would go on in chapter 11, the first two chapters, to talk to them about faith being the substance of that which is not seen, the evidence in our lives of God's power and grace as it transforms us. It's that thing that we grasp hold of in the darkness that helps us to maintain our equilibrium, even when we are fearful and when we are on the edge of panic. God doesn't want you to live your life in panic and fear. No matter the circumstances, He wants you to have confidence in His power and in His ability and in His strength. He wants you to hear His voice in the midst of every chaotic storm of life. I hope you're doing that in your life. God bless you. You have a wonderful day and a tremendous Sunday. God bless.